The first postponement of the season was meant to sound like patience, but Wren Calder heard every practiced word of it. She did not set down her teacup. She did not look toward the window where the Duke of Rothmere stood with his back deliberately turned. She did not give the drawing room the satisfaction of a blush. Rothmere Hall, in the county of Ashdown, had worn the same autumn face for 3 years running, its ivy gone the color of old blood along the east wall, its long windows catching the afternoon light and throwing it back thin and reluctant, as though the house itself had grown tired of pretending warmth it did not feel. The room did not stop for her. A clock on the mantel counted out the silence in small brass increments. Somewhere below, a footman's tray rattled and steadied. They called it an understanding, the arrangement between Miss Wren Calder and His Grace, the Duke of Rothmere. And it was, of every word the county had assembled for the occasion, the politest one they had found for waiting. An understanding required no ring displayed, no banns read, no date fixed upon a calendar where the whole of Ashdown might watch it come and, God willing, arrive. It required only that Wren continue to sit at the edges of rooms like this one, present enough to be accounted for, unofficial enough to be revised. Lady Isolde Beaumont, the Duke's aunt and the true governing force of Rothmere Hall since his mother's death, had delivered the postponement with the gentle regret of a woman discussing a delayed shipment of muslin. 3 years, she said, was hardly so very long, not when a man carried an estate the size of Rothmere upon his shoulders, not when a duke owed the world such careful consideration before he settled a matter as permanent as marriage. Her eyes, moving briefly to Wren, held no cruelty a stranger could have named in a court of law. That was, Wren had come to understand, precisely how cruelty preferred to travel in that house, dressed as concern, addressed to the room rather than to her, its true weight only she was left to carry out the door. No one gasped. No candle guttered dramatically in a sudden draught. The small orchestra of 2 violins and a spinet, engaged for the afternoon's modest entertainment, did not even falter between measures. The world, indifferent as ever to the small deaths that occurred within its drawing rooms, simply resumed. And Wren resumed with it, because resuming was the only skill anyone had ever thought to credit her with. Beneath the high collar of her gray wool dress, plain against the peacock silks around her, her fingers found the ribbon at her throat without her quite deciding to move them, and beneath the ribbon, warmed by her own skin, the ring. It was not fine. It had never pretended to be fine. A plain band of hammered silver, thinned at one edge, where a hand smaller than Wren's own had worn it for 11 years of a marriage that produced exactly 1 daughter, and no fortune worth mentioning. It was the sole inheritance her mother had left her, along with 8 words her mother had said so often in the last months of her illness that Wren no longer heard them as sentiment, but as instruction. The plainest ring can still hold the truest promise, murmured over a mixing bowl, over a hemline, over Wren's own small hand held tight in a hand growing thinner by the week. It was not a ring anyone at Rothmere Hall would have called an heirloom worth remarking upon. Lady Seraphina Voss, seated across the room in blue silk, the exact shade of a summer sky no county in England actually produced, wore at that moment a sapphire the size of a hazelnut, a gift from an admiring uncle rather than a promise from anyone in particular, and had once, with the specific gentleness reserved for insults meant to be admired rather than rebuked, asked whether Wren's ring was pewter, because surely, no one would keep silver looking so very tarnished on purpose. Wren had said only that she found she preferred a thing that had been loved to a thing that merely looked expensive, and the room had laughed, not entirely at Seraphina, which was as close to victory as a woman in Wren's position was permitted to come. It was not a moment anyone else in that room would have called competence. An hour earlier, in the estate office at the rear of the house, Wren had caught an error of £11 4 shillings in the quarterly accounts that the Duke's man of business had missed twice, had corrected it in a neat hand that no one would ever see attached to her name, had refiled the ledger precisely as it had been left so that its correction would be discovered. If it was discovered at all, as though the numbers had simply repented and fixed themselves, no one saw. That, too, was familiar. The uncredited work of Rothmere Hall passed through Wren's hands the way water passes through a house's pipes, essential and invisible, felt only in its absence. She had been 13 when her father died, a scholar of modest means and immodest integrity, who had spent the last years of his life as tutor and confidant to the previous Duke of Rothmere, a man plagued by a weak heart and a stronger conscience. And it was that dying Duke, gripping her father's hand in a sick room Wren had not been permitted to enter, who had extracted from his son Alaric a promise that would outlive them both. That the daughter of the man who had given the old Duke his last honest years would never want for a place in the world. That she would be provided for, protected, and in time married to the heir himself, so that no one could ever again call her Charity. It had sounded, spoken from a deathbed, like the kindest promise a dying man could make. It had become, 3 years into Alaric Vane's dukedom, something considerably less kind in practice, a contract sealed by a father's hand, and honored by a son's silence, kept alive by neither cruelty exactly, nor tenderness exactly, but by the peculiar cowardice of men who cannot bring themselves to break a vow, and cannot bring themselves to keep it either. A promise unfulfilled long enough begins to resemble a debt collecting interest against the very person it was meant to protect. Wren's aunt, Judith Harwick, her late mother's cousin and the only relation willing to take in a penniless girl of 13, had made a comfortable second life for herself in the shadow of that unfulfilled promise, installed at Rothmere as a sort of companion of convenience to Lady Beaumont, fed and housed and consulted on matters of household linen in a manner she would never have enjoyed on her own modest income. It is a peculiar arithmetic of dependency that the person who benefits most from another's endurance is very often the one who counsels her most sweetly to endure. Aunt Judith's affection for Wren was not feigned, precisely, which made it harder to refuse than outright unkindness would have been. She called Wren her clever girl, her patient girl, her good girl, who understood how these things worked among people of consequence, and folded into every endearment a small, steady pressure to remain grateful, to remain quiet, to remain exactly where she had been placed. Gratitude, employed often enough as a leash, begins to feel very much like a collar. It was Aunt Judith who had counseled her, that very afternoon, in the moments before Lady Beaumont's announcement, not to raise the matter of the date again with the Duke, not this quarter. Not while his attentions were so taken up with the harvest reports and, though she did not say the rest of the sentence, with Lady Seraphina Voss, whose family's lands marched alongside Rothmere's own, and whose father had made no secret, over port and pheasant these 3 years, of what alliance he hoped his daughter's beauty might yet secure. The Duke's silence on the matter of the wedding date could have been overridden by a single sentence, spoken plainly in that drawing room, and everyone present understood it, and everyone present understood, too, that the sentence would not come. Alaric Vane, Duke of Rothmere, stood at the tall window through the whole of his aunt's announcement, with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, watching the gray gardens as though they required his supervision, and said nothing at all, not one word in Wren's defense, nor in her dismissal, which was, of every possible response, the one most difficult to forgive. Because a man who says nothing may always be forgiven the sin his silence never quite commits. He was 33, tall in the way that made rooms rearrange themselves around him without his troubling to ask it of them, and possessed of a face that the county's mothers had spent a decade describing to their daughters as severe, though Wren had come to think severe was merely the word people reached for when a man declined to perform the emotions they wished to see. His voice, on the rare occasions he used it in company, never rose, never needed to. A duke's quiet carries further than another man's shout, and Alaric Vane had learned early and well the particular power of a room straining to hear him. He was, by every account the county could produce, feared rather more than loved, exacting with his tenants, precise with his ledgers, and entirely unreadable in matters of his own heart, a subject on which even his oldest friends professed themselves entirely ignorant. What went on behind that stillness, Wren had spent 3 years failing to determine, and had at some point stopped admitting to herself that she still tried. That afternoon, when the room had resettled itself around fresh tea and safer conversation, Wren rose, as she always did, at the exact moment her absence would draw no attention, and crossed to the long gallery that ran the length of the house's western wing, where the portraits of dead dukes and their dutifully married duchesses hung in their gilt frames, watching nothing in particular for centuries at a stretch. She did not weep. There was no scene to speak of, no dropped teacup, no dramatic flight from the room. The world had denied her even the dignity of a proper collapse, offering instead only the small, grinding continuation of an ordinary afternoon in which nothing outwardly had happened at all. It is one of the quieter cruelties of genteel society that its worst wounds are permitted no visible blood. She stood before the portrait of the 3rd Duchess of Rothmere, a woman dead 110 years, whose painted eyes had always struck Wren as unusually kind for the period, and pressed her palm flat against her own sternum, over the ribbon, over the ring, and told herself, in the flat interior voice she reserved for facts too large to say aloud, that she would not ask again. 3 requests for a date had been met with 3 delays dressed as reasonableness, and a woman may be patient a great many times before patience curdles into something closer to complicity in her own erasure. It was not resignation. It was not yet resolve, either. It sat somewhere unnamed between the two, cold and small, and entirely her own. The Duke found her there some 20 minutes later, though found suggested an accident his manner did not quite support. He had a habit, she had noticed over 3 years of watching him, with the attentiveness of a woman who had nothing else productive to do with her feelings, of arriving in rooms he had no obvious reason to enter, standing for a moment longer than business required, and departing again with an excuse so thin it barely troubled to convince. That afternoon his excuse was the gallery's north-facing window, which he claimed, without any particular conviction, wanted inspecting before the winter set in. He did not look at her directly at first. He looked, as she did, at the 3rd Duchess, whose expression had outlasted every fashion in the room around her. It is easier for 2 people who cannot yet speak plainly to each other to address a painting instead. She has a kind face, Wren said, because the silence had gone on a beat too long for either of their comforts, and because it was, of all the things she might have said, the safest. She was known for her charity, the Duke answered, and for very little else, which the family has always considered a species of failure. Wren heard, beneath the dry flatness of it, something she had learned to listen for the way one listens for a second heartbeat beneath a fever, an offering disguised as a fact, a small permission to disagree with him if she dared. "And do you consider it a failure, Your Grace?" she asked, "that a woman should be remembered chiefly for her kindness?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, which had become, over 3 years, its own kind of answer. "I consider it," he said at last, a rarer inheritance than most families manage to produce, and one this family has apparently seen fit to skip an entire generation. It was not a compliment. It was not quite not one either. Ren filed it away with the small collection of similarly unclassifiable remarks he had left with her over the years, sentences that refused to resolve into either warmth or its absence, and said nothing further, because saying nothing further was the one skill she had perfected beyond all others in that house. He left the gallery without inspecting the window at all. That, too, she noted and did not remark upon. A promise deferred long enough teaches its holder to read a man's silences the way a farmer reads weather, for the shape of what is coming rather than for what is being said outright. That evening, the household assembled for a dinner marking the formal opening of the autumn season, an occasion Lady Beaumont had elevated, in the 3 years since the old Duke's death, into something considerably grander than Rothmere's modest guest list strictly warranted, chiefly, Ren suspected, because it gave her the opportunity to seat Lady Seraphina Voss at the Duke's right hand in front of the entire county and call it hospitality. The dining hall at Rothmere had been built by the second Duke with an eye toward intimidation rather than comfort, its ceiling lost in shadow 30 feet above the candlelight, its long table capable of seating 40, though it rarely hosted more than 16, and its walls hung with tapestries so old and so somber that the room seemed, on nights like this one, to be watched by a jury of dead ancestors reserving judgment. Warm light from 100 candles pooled gold across silver and crystal, and the bared shoulders of women dressed for admiration, and somewhere beneath that gold, Ren understood, without anyone troubling to explain it to her again, exactly where a woman of her situation was meant to sit, and exactly how much of that light was meant to reach her. She wore the gray wool, mended twice at the hem, because it was the finest thing she owned that had not been given to her out of pity, and she took her place at the table's lower reach, between Aunt Judith and a spinster cousin of the Beaumont line, who had long ago perfected the art of speaking only to people who could advance her, which excluded Ren from conversation as thoroughly as a locked door. Lady Seraphina, 3 seats up and gowned in a shade of rose that had clearly been selected to flatter candlelight rather than daylight, held court over the middle of the table with the easy, weightless charm of a woman who had never once had to calculate the cost of a remark before making it. It is a particular gift, charm of that kind, the kind the world rewards without asking what it costs anyone standing nearby. Seraphina possessed it the way other women possessed good posture, without labor, without thought, and the room Ren had observed over 3 years forgave her nearly everything for it, laughing at cruelties from her mouth that would have earned a plainer woman the label of shrew. "I understand," Seraphina said partway through the second course, turning her attention down the table with the particular delighted brightness of a woman about to be witty at someone else's expense, "that congratulations are once again premature, Miss Calder. 3 years is such a very long understanding to sustain. One does wonder at what point an understanding simply becomes a habit no one has the heart to break." The words sounded, to anyone not listening closely, like sympathy extended between friends. The pressure folded beneath them was not sympathy at all, and everyone at that end of the table, pausing fork to plate, understood the distinction perfectly well, even as no one troubled to name it aloud. It was not a question. Ren set down her own fork with a care that cost her more than the gesture revealed, and answered in the mild, level voice she had spent 3 years cultivating specifically for occasions such as this one. "Habits, Lady Seraphina, are generally formed from things worth repeating. I confess I have never thought to resent an arrangement simply for lasting. The laughter that followed was not universal, but it was enough. A ripple down the lower half of the table, where the guests less invested in flattering the Voss family sat closer to Wren's own circumstances than to Serafina's, and it left a thin, satisfying welt across the evening that no one but Wren would ever fully credit her for landing. Lady Beaumont, presiding at the table's head with the serene authority of a woman who considered herself above its skirmishes, chose that moment to observe, to the table at large, that patience was so very unfashionable a virtue these days, and so very necessary in a woman who hoped to be a duchess, was it not, my dear? Glancing at Wren with an expression composed entirely of concern, and containing not one particle of it. Politeness, Wren had come to understand over 3 years in that house, was only the respectable coat cruelty had learned to wear when it wished to be admitted to better company. She inclined her head to Lady Beaumont with exactly the degree of deference the room required, and said that she supposed a virtue was only unfashionable until the moment it was needed, at which point the whole room generally discovered a sudden admiration for it, and if there was an edge beneath that sentence sharp enough to draw a very small amount of blood. No one at the table could have proven it in a court of law, which was, after all, precisely the point of learning to speak that way. The Duke, seated at the table's head opposite his aunt, had said almost nothing through the whole of the exchange, his attention seemingly given over to the wine at his elbow, and it would have been easy, watching him as Wren had learned to watch him, to conclude that he had heard none of it. She did not conclude that. She had spent 3 years learning the particular stillness that overtook him when he was listening far more closely than his posture admitted, a stillness she had once mistaken for indifference and now understood to be something closer to restraint exercised for reasons she could not name. When Serafina, emboldened by her earlier success, opened her mouth to add some further glancing cruelty to the pile, the Duke spoke for the first time since the soup course, his voice pitched low enough that it required the whole table's attention to lean in and catch it, which was, Wren had noticed, precisely how a man accustomed to being obeyed ensured he was never made to raise his voice at. All. Miss Calder corrected an error in the Eastern tenancy accounts this morning that would have cost this estate £11, he said, addressing no one in particular, and therefore, somehow, everyone. I find I have very little patience remaining this evening for anyone inclined to question the value of patience itself. It was not a defense delivered with warmth. It was delivered, if anything, with the flat, procedural finality of a man closing a ledger, and it was, for exactly that reason, more devastating to its intended target than any warmer words could have managed, because it named Wren's worth not as a kindness owed to her, but as a fact the room was now required to accept whether it wished to or not. Serafina's mouth closed. Somewhere down the table, a spoon met a bowl with a small, involuntary click, the sound of an entire dinner party recalibrating itself in real time. Wren did not look at him. She was aware, with an awareness so sharp it felt almost like pain, of every place in the room his attention had ever rested on her before that moment. Brief, glancing, deniable, and of how thoroughly this single sentence had broken the pattern of deniability she had spent 3 years learning to live inside. It was not admiration. Not yet. But it was recognition, offered in front of witnesses who would remember it whether he intended them to or not, and recognition, once spoken aloud in a room full of people keeping score, has a way of refusing to be taken back. The rest of the dinner proceeded, as dinners in that house always proceeded, with the smooth, glassy continuation of a world that had already decided nothing of consequence had occurred. Dessert arrived. A footman's candle guttered and was relit without ceremony. Lady Beaumont steered the conversation toward the coming county assembly with the practiced ease of a woman closing a door she had not enjoyed having opened. No one at that table, watching the fruit course circulate and the second bottle of claret opened, could have said with any certainty that anything at all had shifted in the 3 years of careful stalemate between the Duke of Rothmere and the ward his father had promised him to. And yet, something had. Wren felt it the way one feels a change of weather before the sky itself has troubled to announce it, a pressure behind the ordinary air of the evening that had not been there an hour before. Later, when the ladies withdrew and the gentlemen remained over their port, Aunt Judith caught her arm in the corridor with a grip that mingled affection and warning in equal measure, and murmured that Wren must be more careful, that a man's notice, however flattering, was a dangerous thing to invite in a house like this one, that Lady Beaumont did not forget slights, however small, and that a girl in Wren's position could not afford to make an enemy of Lady Seraphina Voss's family, not with the harvest tenancies up for renewal and half the county's good opinion resting on staying agreeably invisible. It is a peculiar mercy some people believe they are extending when they counsel a woman to make herself smaller for her own protection. Wren thanked her aunt with the automatic gratitude she had long ago learned to produce on command, and said nothing of the small, stubborn warmth that had lodged itself somewhere beneath her ribs since dinner, because that warmth, however modest, felt like the first thing in 3 years that belonged entirely to her and to no one else's management. She did not sleep well that night. She rarely did in that house, but this particular wakefulness had a different texture to it, less the familiar ache of grievance, and more the unfamiliar, faintly alarming sensation of a door she had believed permanently sealed shifting, almost imperceptibly, on its hinge. In the weeks that followed, the shift proved neither dramatic nor swift, which was, Wren was coming to understand, precisely how the Duke of Rothmere did everything that mattered to him. He began finding reasons, thin as autumn light, to require her presence in the estate office in the mornings, ostensibly to review the very accounts she had already corrected without his asking, though it did not escape her notice that his questions, once she arrived, rarely concerned the ledgers for very long. He asked her opinion of the Eastern Tenancy's proposed drainage works, listened to her answer without the faint, indulgent smile-men of his rank, generally reserved for a woman's competence, and altered his own plans, once on the strength of what she had said, a small concession that cost him nothing in the world's eyes, and everything in the private accounting Wren had begun. Despite every resolution to the contrary, to keep of him. He was, she found, in these unwatched exchanges, a considerably different creature than the cool, unreadable figure the county had assembled its opinion of him from. His dry wit, licensed by rank to say things that would have earned another man a reprimand, turned out to be aimed most often at himself, delivered so quietly that a listener had to be paying very close attention to catch that he was joking at all. When she once observed, testing the ice of a new informality between them, that a duke correcting his own arithmetic errors seemed a rare enough sight to warrant a commemorative plaque, he had replied, without lifting his eyes from the page, that the estate would sooner commission a plaque for the day he stopped requiring her to correct them for him, and the words had sat in the quiet office afterward with a weight neither of them moved to acknowledge. It was not admiration, she told herself again, each time the accounting in her chest grew a little heavier. Not yet, but she had begun, despite every instinct toward self-protection 3 years of careful disappointment had taught her, to notice the particular quality of stillness that came over him in the moments just before he spoke to her, a stillness she did not recognize from any other room in that house, and to wonder, in the small, guarded hours when wondering felt safest, whether he had begun to notice something in return. Lady Seraphina noticed it first, or noticed it loudest, which amounted to nearly the same thing in a house where information traveled through drawing rooms faster than any letter could travel through the post. The barbs that had once arrived at Wren's expense with the lazy, occasional rhythm of a woman confident in her own position began arriving with a new frequency and a new precision, each one aimed now not merely at Wren's status, but at the specific, unspoken fact of the Duke's growing attention, dressed always in the same deniable solicitude that made them impossible to answer directly. How very devoted Miss Calder has become to the estate ledgers of late, Serafina observed one afternoon in the small salon, to a circle of half-listening ladies over their needlework. One begins to wonder whether the accounts themselves require quite so very much personal attention, or whether Miss Calder has simply discovered a new understanding of where her usefulness truly lies. The word usefulness sat in the room like a struck bell. It was, Wren understood immediately, no accident of vocabulary. It was the sharpest tool in the box, precision aimed at the exact bruise 3 years of unpaid, uncredited labor had left on her, and delivered with a smile warm enough that any woman who objected to it could be made to look, in the room's estimation, unreasonably thin-skinned. Wren set down her own needlework with the deliberate calm of a woman declining to give an audience the reaction it had paid admission to see. "I have always found figures more restful company than gossip," she said, and considerably less prone to embellishment, and let the room's laughter fall where it liked, because she had learned, over 3 years, that the only truly ungovernable weapon available to a woman in her position was the refusal to be governed by another woman's aim. Everything Wren said in that house, she reflected on nights the day's small battles kept her from sleep, everything she withheld saying, every insult she absorbed, and every retort she measured and chose not to spend, had begun to feel less like defeat accumulating and more like a ledger of its own, patient, exact, and waiting, the way her father's had once waited, for the day someone finally troubled to read it honestly. Every woman who learns to survive a room like that one learns, sooner or later, that silence spent wisely is worth more than speech spent in anger. She did not yet know what she intended to do with 3 years of that particular currency. She knew only that the balance had begun, for the first time since her father's death, to feel less like a debt she owed the world, and more like something the world might, eventually, be made to repay. That accounting deepened by inches through the weeks that followed, the way a tide deepens, imperceptible in any single hour, and undeniable across a season. By the middle of November, the estate office had become, without either of them naming it as such, the one room at Rothmere Hall where the architecture of the house's cruelty did not seem to reach, and Wren found herself arriving there earlier each morning than the Duke's summons strictly required, telling herself it was only the fire that drew her, only the quiet, only the satisfaction of columns that balanced when so little else in her life did. Alaric Vane had a way, in that room, of setting down his pen the instant she entered, a small courtesy so consistent she had begun, against every resolution to the contrary, to expect it, and to feel its absence on the morning's business called him elsewhere, the way one feels the absence of a sound one has stopped noticing until it stops. He did not speak to her there as a duke speaks to a dependent. He argued with her, mildly, over the wisdom of the new drainage contract, conceded points he had no obligation to concede. And once, when she corrected an error in his own hand rather than his steward's, looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not entirely classify before observing, in the dry, understated register that passed for his highest compliment, that it was a fortunate thing for the House of Rothmere that its ledgers had found a keeper more honest than its heir. It was not admiration, she told herself, folding the remark away with the others. Not yet. But the collection had grown heavy enough by then that she had stopped pretending, in the privacy of her own mind, that she was not counting it. The county, meanwhile, continued its own accounting, less generous and considerably louder. Lady Serafina Voss had not abandoned the campaign begun at the autumn dinner. She had only refined it, trading blunt barbs for a subtler, more patient cruelty better suited to a siege than a skirmish. She began appearing in the estate office's doorway on invented errands timed, with unerring precision, to interrupt whatever quiet had settled between Wren and the Duke, offering some bright, solicitous remark about how very hard Miss Calder worked, how very devoted, how very useful, the word deployed each time with the same faint emphasis, like a coin turned to show its tarnished side. Usefulness was, Wren had come to understand, the precise instrument Serafina had chosen to wound her with, because it took the very thing that gave Wren's presence in that house its only real justification and reframed it as evidence of her lowness rather than her worth. A woman is useful the way a tool is useful. A woman is beloved the way a wife is beloved. The distance between those two words was the whole of what Wren had been denied for 3 years, and Serafina knew it, and used it, with the easy cruelty of a woman who had never once had to earn the alternative. Wren's replies, when she troubled to make them, never rose to meet the barb directly. "I find I am fonder of usefulness than of ornament," she said once, meeting Serafina's bright smile with one of her own, since ornament, I am told, tends to lose its shine the moment it is set down, while usefulness may be relied upon again and again. It was not a devastating retort by the standards of a stage comedy. It did not need to be. It landed exactly where it was aimed, in the small private place where Serafina's confidence, built entirely upon admiration rather than substance, had never learned to defend itself, and the flicker that crossed her face before she recovered her smile was reward enough for a woman who had learned to prize small victories because large ones were never offered her. Lady Beaumont observed these exchanges from her customary seat near the good light, with an expression of serene neutrality that fooled no one who had spent 3 years learning to read it, and confined her own interventions to occasional remarks about how very odd it was it not, that an understanding of 3 years' standing seemed no nearer resolution now than it had been at its outset. Remarks aimed less at wounding Wren directly than at keeping the question of the wedding date perpetually unsettled in the Duke's hearing, a small, persistent erosion designed to wear away whatever resolve his recent attentions to Wren might be gathering. A house that wishes a thing forgotten need not forbid it outright. It need only mention, gently and often, that the thing has not yet happened. It was into this slow siege that Captain Rhys Dunmore arrived, some 3 weeks before the turn of the year, an old friend of the Duke's from his years in the cavalry, invited to Rothmere for the shooting and installed, within a single evening, as the one person in the house who seemed entirely unbothered by its careful arithmetic of rank and reserve. He was broad where the Duke was lean, loud where the Duke was quiet, and possessed of the particular gift, rare in that house, of saying exactly what he observed without troubling to dress it first. He found Wren on the second morning of his visit in the small library adjoining the estate office, a book of estate surveys open on her lap that she had not, in truth, been reading for some minutes, and settled himself into the chair opposite with the unhurried confidence of a man who had decided, on very little evidence, that he liked her. "You are the one who corrects his arithmetic," he said, by way of introduction, "and I confess I have been wanting to meet you since he mentioned it in a letter 8 months ago, and then never mentioned anything else of substance again for the length of our entire correspondence, which, for a man who once wrote me 4 pages on the proper drainage of a turnip field, I found rather telling." Wren said, carefully, that she supposed a man's correspondence reflected whatever occupied him at the time of writing, and Captain Dunmore laughed, a short, delighted bark of a sound entirely unsuited to the hushed decorum of Rothmere's library, and said that in 11 years of friendship, he had never once known Alaric Vane to be occupied by anything he could not immediately explain. Until apparently now, and he had begun to suspect the explanation was sitting across from him with a survey book she had not turned a single page of in the quarter hour he'd been watching her. Wren closed the book. "You are very direct, Captain," she said. "Someone in this house ought to be," he answered, not unkindly, "since I have observed in 3 days that everyone else here has perfected the art of saying a great deal while meaning almost nothing by it, present company, I suspect, rather deliberately accepted." He left the library a few minutes later on some invented errand of his own, pausing at the door to observe. With the particular warmth of a man who did not expect to be contradicted, that he had known Alaric a very long time, through worse things than turnip fields, and had never seen him watch a room the way he watched it now. Waiting, without appearing to wait, for one particular person to enter it. It was the kind of observation Wren could not rebut, and did not try to, because rebutting it would have required naming, aloud, a hope she had not yet permitted herself to hold with both hands. It was Lady Prowse who arrived, some 10 days later, at the county assembly held in the village of Millbrook's modest but respectable rooms, and altered the shape of the winter considerably. She was a viscountess of some 70 years, widowed twice, immensely wealthy in her own right, through an inheritance no husband had ever managed to touch, and possessed of a tongue the whole of Ashdown had learned to fear and court in equal measure, since her good opinion, once given, was worth more socially than a dozen invitations from lesser hostesses, and her bad opinion, once formed, was rarely revised. She arrived at the assembly leaning on an ebony cane she did not, by all appearances, require, surveyed the room with the flat, assessing gaze of a woman pricing livestock, and made directly, without preamble, for the corner where Wren stood at the customary margin of things, half obscured by a large arrangement of hothouse flowers that Lady Beaumont had ordered specifically. Wren suspected, to occupy the space where a lesser family might have seated their poor relations more visibly. "You are the Calder girl," Lady Prowse said, without introduction, planting her cane and regarding Wren over spectacles that magnified nothing so much as the shrewdness of the eyes behind them. "I knew your father, a better scholar than half the fellows who called themselves his betters, and considerably more honest, which in my experience are rarely found in the same man twice." Wren, startled by the abruptness of it, managed only that she was glad to hear him remembered kindly, and Lady Prowse made a small dismissive sound, as though kindness were beside the point entirely. "I do not remember people kindly, girl," she said. "I remember them accurately, which is a rarer courtesy and considerably more useful to the dead." She turned her attention then, with the same unhurried scrutiny, to the room at large, to Lady Beaumont holding court near the punch, to Seraphina Voss laughing prettily at the center of a knot of admiring young men, and observed, apropos of nothing anyone had asked her, that she had watched 3 years of this county's whispering about an understanding that any fool with functioning eyes could see was no longer merely an understanding on one side of it, whatever it remained on paper, and that she had very little patience left for watching a good man's cowardice dressed up as caution while a better woman than the room deserved was made to wait upon it. She did not explain further. She did not need to. It was, Wren would think later, the first time in 3 years that anyone in a position of real consequence had simply believed her worth, without requiring it proven first, and the effect of that unearned faith was disproportionate to the plainness of the words that had delivered it, the way a single dry log catches fastest in a fire that has been smoldering too long on damp wood. Lady Prowse took Wren's arm before the evening was through, and walked her the length of the assembly room twice, in full view of everyone who cared to notice, a public claiming of favor that no one in Ashdown, however inclined to unkindness, would risk crossing. Since Lady Prowse's enmity was a considerably worse fate than Lady Beaumont's condescension, and by the time the carriages were called that night, the balance of whispered opinion in the county had shifted, by some small but measurable degree, in Wren's favor. It was, Wren thought as she watched the assembly room's candlelight blur past the carriage window on the ride home, the first evening in 3 years she had left a public gathering without the particular, familiar ache of having survived rather than lived it. That small mercy did not last the fortnight. It arrived on a Tuesday, the letter that would undo the fragile momentum Lady Prowse's favor had begun to build, delivered not to Wren but to Mr. Pruitt, the Duke's solicitor, in a plain hand with no signature and a postmark from nowhere more particular than the county town, and it did not take Mr. Pruitt above an hour to determine that its contents, however anonymous their origin, could not simply be filed away and ignored. The letter alleged, in language of careful legal precision that suggested its author possessed at least a passing familiarity with the law of contracts, that the deathbed letter of the 6th Duke of Rothmere, the very document upon which the whole of Wren's 3-year understanding with his son had rested, the letter directing his heir to provide for and eventually marry the daughter of his late tutor, was not what it had always been assumed to be. It was, the letter claimed, a forgery composed not on the 6th Duke's deathbed at all, but some years afterward, by Wren's own hand or by an accomplice acting on her behalf, and inserted among the estate's legal papers at a time when a grieving household's attention had been fixed elsewhere. A deliberate fraud designed to secure for a penniless scholar's daughter a claim upon a dukedom she had no legitimate right to hold. The accusation did not merely threaten to dissolve the understanding that had governed 3 years of Wren's life. It threatened to convert her, in the eyes of the law and the county both, from an unfortunate ward awaiting an overdue kindness into a criminal who had manufactured her own fortune through deceit, a charge grave enough to end not merely in social ruin, but in prosecution, in the assizes, in a courtroom where her father's memory would be dragged through the same mud as her own name. It is a particular horror, reserved for those who possess almost nothing, to discover that even the little they do possess can be reclassified, overnight, as theft. Mr. Pruitt, a careful man who had served the Rothmere family for over 20 years and had no wish to be the one who either buried a legitimate fraud or destroyed an innocent woman on the strength of an unsigned letter, brought the matter first to the Duke, and only then, with evident reluctance, to Wren herself, in the estate office, on a gray morning that felt. From the first moment she understood what was being said to her, entirely unlike any of the mornings that had come before it. She did not weep. She had promised herself, somewhere in the gallery 3 years deep now, that she would not give this house the satisfaction of watching her break, and she did not break, though her hand found the ribbon at her throat and closed around the ring beneath it with a grip that left the metal's edge printed faintly into her palm for an hour afterward. The plainest ring can still hold the truest promise, her mother's voice said, from a decade's distance, and Wren thought, with the particular clarity that arrives only in the worst moments, that a promise accused of being false was still, whatever the county decided, no less true for having been doubted. "I did not forge that letter," she said, to Mr. Pruitt, to the Duke, to the cold morning light filling the office windows, in a voice she kept level through an act of will that cost her more than anyone in that room would ever know. "I was 13 years old when your father died, Your Grace. I did not know that letter existed until I was told of its contents at 14 by your father's own solicitor, in this house, in the presence of witnesses who are, I imagine, still living and still capable of confirming as much." The Duke, standing at the window in the posture she had learned over 3 years to read as concealment rather than indifference, did not immediately answer, and in the silence that followed, brief as it was, Wren felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. Because a man's silence, however she had learned to parse its finer shades, was still, in the end, silence, and silence in the face of an accusation this grave could be read, by a woman braced for disappointment, only one way. "I believe you," he said finally, and turned from the window to look at her directly, with an intensity that startled her more than the accusation itself had, because in 3 years she had rarely seen him look at anything, least of all a person, with that particular unguarded weight. "I have never for one moment doubted the honesty of anyone who has spent 3 years correcting my ledgers without once padding a column in her own favor." It was not a grand declaration. It was, in its dry, understated way, the largest thing he had ever said to her. And it did not, in itself, solve anything at all, because belief, however sincerely offered, was not proof, and proof was what the law and the county and Lady Beaumont's carefully neutral expression across the breakfast table that evening would require before the matter could be laid to rest. It was Lady Prowse, summoned by a note from Wren that she had agonized over sending and sent anyway, who arrived at Rothmere within the day, cane striking the flagstones with the particular emphasis of a woman spoiling for a fight she intended to win. "I did not survive 2 husbands and 40 years of this county's small malice to watch a good girl hanged for another woman's jealousy," she announced, to no one and everyone, settling herself in the estate office as though she had been consulted on the matter from its outset, and demanded to see the letter and the document it accused, side by side, on the desk before her, along with every scrap of correspondence the estate possessed, bearing the 6th Duke's hand and seal from the final 2 years of his life. It was Wren, poring over those papers through a long, cold afternoon, with Lady Prowse at her elbow and Mr. Pruitt hovering with the particular anxiety of a man watching his professional caution overtaken by 2 women considerably less inclined to caution than himself, who found it, not in the accused letter itself, which was, on every visible measure, a convincing match for the 6th Duke's known hand, but in the anonymous accusation that had prompted its examination in the first place. The letter's author, in laying out the supposed proof of forgery, had described the deathbed document as bearing, in its wax seal, the impression of the Rothmere crest surrounded by the laurel border the family had adopted, the anonymous writer claimed. Decades before the 6th Duke's death, evidence, the letter argued, that the document could not have been created at the time claimed, since the seal used upon it was in fact of a much later design. It was a clever accusation, precise enough to sound authoritative to anyone who had not spent 3 years handling the estate's correspondence with the particular, unglamorous thoroughness of a woman with nothing better to occupy her attention. Wren had. And Wren knew, with the flat, immovable certainty of a fact rather than an opinion, that the laurel border had not existed decades before the 6th Duke's death at all. It had been commissioned by Alaric himself, from the seal cutter in Ashdown Market Town, not 8 months into his own dukedom, a small vanity of succession he had mentioned to her once, in passing, in this very office. As an economy he'd nearly talked himself out of, before deciding a new duke ought to mark his seal somehow. The anonymous letter, in its zeal to prove the deathbed document a forgery, had described the wrong seal entirely. A seal that would not exist for another 6 years after the moment it claimed to be examining. Which meant the letter's author had either never actually seen the 6th Duke's genuine seal at all, or had seen only Alaric's current one and mistakenly assumed, in careless haste, that it had always looked the same. "There it is," Wren said, very quietly, into the hush of the office, and set the two documents down side by side on the desk with hands that had gone, for the first time in the whole ordeal, perfectly steady. Lady Prowse leaned over the desk, examined the seals through her spectacles with the slow, deliberate satisfaction of a woman watching an enemy's own weapon turn in her hand, and pronounced, with evident relish, that whoever had written this letter knew Rothmir's current seal a great deal more intimately than they knew its history, which meant, whatever else remained unproven, that the anonymous accuser was very likely someone with recent, regular access to the Duke's own correspondence rather than any impartial party, with genuine knowledge of events 3 decades old. It did not take Mr. Pruitt above another day of careful inquiry, aided by Lady Prowse's considerable talent for extracting information from servants who feared her rather more than they feared their actual employers, to establish that a maid recently dismissed from Lady Seraphina Voss's own household had, within the same fortnight, been observed delivering correspondence to the county town's posting office on behalf of her former mistress, correspondence the maid, once found and gently but firmly questioned, admitted she had been paid, handsomely and under strict instruction, to secrecy, to carry. Seraphina Voss, confronted at last in Lady Beaumont's own drawing room, in front of witnesses she could not charm into silence, did not confess outright. No woman of her breeding would have surrendered so completely. But the color that left her face when Lady Prowse laid the two seals before her, side by side, and asked, in the driest voice the room had yet heard from her, whether Lady Seraphina cared to explain how a document meant to expose a 30-year-old forgery had managed to describe a seal not 6 years in existence, was confession enough for anyone present who still required convincing. It was not, in the end, love of the truth that undid her. It was the same careless overconfidence that had made her charm so effective for so long. The assumption that no one in that house was watching closely enough to catch the seams of her own deceit. An assumption Wren's 3 years of uncredited, unglamorous attention to every scrap of paper that passed through Rothmir's offices had finally, decisively proven false. A woman who has spent years believing herself unseen makes, it turns out, a remarkably thorough witness. The Duke did not shout. He did not, in front of the assembled household, deliver the kind of dramatic denunciation the moment might have seemed to call for. He simply informed Lady Seraphina, in the same low, unhurried voice that had once silenced an entire dinner table over a lesser cruelty, that she and her family would no longer be received at Rothmere Hall, that the matter would go no further toward the assizes, provided it went no further at all in any direction. A mercy he extended, he said, not for her sake, but because a public prosecution would drag Wren's name through exactly the kind of scrutiny the letter had been designed to invite, and he found he had no wish to hand his enemy that particular victory, even in her defeat. It was restraint of a kind the room had not expected from a man the county called severe, the deliberate choice not to take the vengeance so plainly within his reach, and Wren, watching him decline it, understood, with a clarity that settled somewhere beneath the relief and the exhaustion of the whole ordeal, that mercy withheld from an enemy at real cost to oneself was a rarer and more moving thing than any punishment could have been. Lady Beaumont, for her part, said remarkably little in the days that followed, though something in her manner toward Wren shifted, minutely, into a wariness that had not been present before, the particular respect a strategist affords an opponent who has proven unexpectedly harder to dislodge than anticipated. Aunt Judith wept when the whole affair had settled and held Wren's hands, and said she had never doubted her for a moment, a claim Wren accepted with the same automatic grace she had extended to 100 smaller hypocrisies over 3 years, because there was no profit left in relitigating old cowardice on a day that had already asked so much of everyone's courage. It was Lady Prowse, gathering her cane and her considerable dignity to depart Rothmere 2 days later, who paused at the door of the estate office, looked back at Wren with an expression that had softened, almost imperceptibly, from its usual flint, and observed that she had known a great many clever women in her 70 years, and considerably fewer honest ones, and that the particular tragedy of Wren's situation had never been a want of worth, but a world too idle or too frightened to trouble itself with counting it accurately, a fault the world could still be made to correct if certain parties still resident under this roof found, at some point, the courage their rank had never actually required them to earn. She did not name the Duke. She did not need to. The remark hung in the office after she had gone the way certain sentences do, settling into the walls of a room and refusing entirely to be dislodged. The weather turned that same week, a hard early winter descending over Ashdown with a suddenness the almanacs had not predicted, and the household at Rothmere, still unsettled from the scandal so narrowly contained, drew inward around its fires with the particular quiet of a house recovering from a fever. It was on the 4th such evening, with sleet beginning to lash the tall windows of the long gallery and the wind finding every ill-fitted seam in the old house's stonework to moan through, that the Duke sought Wren out where she sat, later than she ought to have stayed, in the estate office finishing accounts that did not, in truth, require finishing that night. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before she was aware of him, in the particular stillness she had learned, over 3 years, to recognize as the shape he wore when something in him had finally stopped being contained by silence, and when she looked up and found him watching her, the ledger in her lap forgotten, the fire guttering low in the grate, the storm rising audibly beyond the glass. Neither of them spoke at once, because some conversations announce themselves before a single word is exchanged, the way a held breath announces the exhale it is about to release, and both of them, standing at the threshold of whatever this had finally become, seemed to understand, without needing to say it, that whatever was coming would not be said in passing, and would not be said in that office, with its ledgers and its careful daylight honesty, but somewhere the storm outside could stand witness to it instead. The conservatory at the end of the western wing had been built by the 4th Duke for a wife who died before its glass roof was finished, and it had stood ever since as the one room at Rothmere Hall too impractical for Lady Beaumont's careful economies and too fragile for her ambitions, glass on 3 sides and overhead, filled with the ghosts of ferns that had outlived every gardener assigned to tend them, and it was there, rather than the gallery, that Alaric led her, through corridors gone dark and cold with the storm's insistence, until they stood together beneath a roof that shuddered under sleet turning slowly, audibly, to snow. It was near 2 a.m. by the small clock on the conservatory's single table, though neither of them had thought to mark the hour until much later. The glass around them rattled in its old lead seams. Somewhere beyond it, lightning that had traveled far enough to lose its thunder lit the black gardens white for half a second at a time. And in each flash, Wren could see the shape of the man across from her, still, unmoving, watching her with an intensity he had spent 3 years disguising as reserve. He did not close the distance between them all at once. He crossed it the way a man crosses ice he has never fully trusted, one measured step and then a pause to test what the step had cost him, and Wren, watching him come, understood without being told that whatever he had walked her through that storm to say had waited 3 years precisely because it could not be said quickly. "I have rehearsed this a great many times," he said, and his voice, when it finally broke the silence, had lost the particular flatness she had spent 3 years learning to read for its hidden weather. It sounded, for the first time since she had known him, simply like a man's voice, unguarded by rank, unpolished by the performance a dukedom required of every syllable he generally spent. I have rehearsed it in this room, and in the office, and on horseback in weather considerably worse than tonight's, and every version I composed sounded, upon examination, like an apology, and I have come to understand, rather too slowly, that an apology is not what 3 years of silence has earned the right to offer you. I did not delay this marriage because I doubted you, he said, and took another step, close enough now that the stormlight caught fully on his face and left nothing of it hidden. I did not delay it because your worth required proving, though God knows this house has demanded you prove it 100 times over for the crime of having none of its money and all of its honesty. I did not delay it, he said, and his voice roughened on the words in a way that told her, more than the sentence itself, how long he had carried them unsaid, because I did not believe, 3 years ago, that I deserved to claim a promise my father extracted from a dying man's grief, rather than my own courage, and I told myself that giving you time, giving you the appearance of choice, was a kindness, when the truth, which I have only lately had the stomach to examine, is that it was cowardice wearing kindness's coat, exactly as every cruelty in this house has always worn it. And I let you live inside my hesitation for 3 years, because facing my own fear felt, God help me, harder than watching you endure it. It was not admiration any longer. It had not been admiration for some time, if she was honest with the accounting she had kept so carefully, and Wren stood in the shuddering glass light and let herself, for one unguarded moment, feel the full unadorned weight of what 3 years of withheld feeling could finally cost a room when it was permitted to speak. There was a version of this moment in which she wept and closed the distance and let the whole aching architecture of 3 years collapse into relief. She had imagined that version in the private, guarded hours when imagining it felt safest, more times than she would ever admit to another living soul. She did not live inside that version now. She thought, standing there, of every retort she might have spent on him across 3 years and had not, every devastating truth about his silence and his family's arithmetic, and the particular loneliness of being loved, perhaps, but never claimed, that she had swallowed rather than spoken, because speaking them would have cost her the one thing she had left, the composure that had kept her whole while everything else about her position had been made provisional. She could have told him that a man's courage arriving 3 years late was still, in the ledger she had kept, 3 years overdue. She could have told him that she had watched Serafina Voss wear his hesitation like a victory and had said nothing, that she had watched his aunt use the word understanding as a leash and had said nothing, that she had corrected his family's arithmetic in 100 silent mornings and been thanked, when thanked at all, in the coin of small compliments rather than the coin of a public claim. She did not say any of it. Every one of those sentences sat in her, sharp and ready, and she let them sit there, because she had learned, across 3 years of exactly this kind of restraint, that the sentence withheld could be a stronger answer than the sentence spent, and she found, standing in that cold glass room with the storm hammering the roof above them, that she wanted, more than she wanted the relief of collapsing into him, to answer him from a position of her own choosing, rather than his need. I am not going to tell you that this is enough, she said, and her voice held steady in a way that surprised her even as she spoke, because I have spent 3 years being told, in every possible gentle phrasing this house could invent, that patience was a virtue I owed the people who benefited from it, and I find, tonight, that I have finished paying that particular debt. I believe you, she said, watching something in his face brace itself for a refusal she had not yet decided whether to give. I believe every word of what you have just said to me, and I do not doubt, any longer, that it is true. But belief is not the same as surrender, Alaric, and I will not walk out of this room simply grateful that you have finally arrived at a door I have been standing behind for 3 years. It was not accusation. It was not quite forgiveness either. It sat deliberately in the narrow space between the two, and she watched him absorb it, watched the muscle along his jaw go tight, and then, with visible effort, still, a man learning in real time that the woman he had kept waiting had grown, in the waiting, into someone who would not simply be handed back her old patience the moment he finally asked for it. "I am going to set a date," she said, and the words arrived in her whole and certain, as though some part of her had been composing them for longer than she had realized. "A date of my own choosing, on my own terms, and I am not going to send you a card requesting the honor of your presence, because I have spent 3 years being present at your convenience, and I find I would like, once in this arrangement, to see whether you will come to mine without being asked." He did not argue. That, more than anything he might have said, told her something had shifted permanently in the room's balance of power, because a man accustomed to being obeyed does not, ordinarily, receive an ultimatum from a woman with no fortune and no title, and simply stand there absorbing it as though it were the most reasonable thing he had heard all winter. "Then I will come," he said, quietly, without argument and without the particular wounded pride she had half expected from him, "or I will spend the rest of my life explaining to myself why I did not. And I find, having examined both futures rather thoroughly tonight, that only one of them is survivable." He reached for her hand then, not suddenly, not with any presumption, simply extended his own and let it rest open between them. An offering rather than a claim, and when she placed her hand in his, when his fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that felt, after 3 years of careful distance, almost unbearable, he did not release it even as she turned half away, toward the conservatory door and the cold corridor beyond, still uncertain, still unwilling to call this reconciliation by any easier name than the truth. Aloud, he held on. She let him. It was, she would think later, the entire history of the last 3 years compressed into a single small mechanics, a hand not withdrawn and a hand not let go, and it was there, in that unglamorous, unresolved middle distance between refusal and surrender, that the tears finally came. Not as collapse, not as the dissolution she had spent 3 years refusing to permit herself in front of anyone, but as something closer to a dam giving way after holding back a much larger and much older water than this single night accounted for. Grief for her father and her mother and 13 years of learning to be useful rather than loved, released all at once because it had finally, after 3 years, found a room safe enough to be released in. He did not tell her to stop. He did not offer the easy, hollow comfort of a man uncomfortable with a woman's weeping. He simply stood, holding her hand in the cold glass light, and let the storm outside do the only talking either of them required for several minutes, and when the tears finally slowed, she found she felt not diminished by them, but lighter, as though something long carried had finally been set down where it belonged. "This is not yes," she said again, quietly, wiping her face with the back of her free hand in a gesture entirely unbecoming of a duchess-to-be, and not caring in the slightest. "But it is no longer only patience either." He said that he understood, and she believed, watching his face in the storm's intermittent light, that he did. Some 3 months later, on a morning in early April that arrived clear and mild after a week of hard spring rain, the village of Millbrook and the whole surrounding parish of Ashdown turned out for a wedding that Wren Calder had planned entirely on her own authority. In a modest stone chapel she had chosen herself for the plainness of its windows and the honesty of its worn floor rather than for. any grandeur it could offer. On a date she had fixed the moment the frost first broke, the anniversary, though few beyond Lady Prowse knew it, of the day her mother had slipped the plain silver ring onto her father's hand some 30 years before. Lady Prowse had taken charge of the arrangements, with the ferocious, delighted efficiency of a general finally given a campaign worthy of her talents, commandeering flowers and musicians and the goodwill of half the county with a speed that left even Mr. Pruitt faintly astonished, and had insisted over Wren's mild protest that no formal invitation be sent anywhere near Rothmere Hall, since the whole point of the exercise, as she put it with characteristic bluntness, was to discover what a man's feet would do when his pride was given nothing whatsoever to lean on. The county had, by then, largely converted to Wren's cause, a shift that had gathered momentum through the long winter following the exposure of Serafina Voss's forgery, a scandal that had cost the Voss family a season's worth of invitations and a considerable portion of the Earl's carefully cultivated standing, until father and daughter had quietly withdrawn to a distant property in the north, and were spoken of in Ashdown drawing rooms, when spoken of at all, with the particular cool finality reserved for names no longer worth the breath. Lady Beaumont, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of gentle, deniable cruelty, arrived at the little chapel that morning in a plain gray gown considerably less grand than her usual custom, and took a seat toward the back of the modest crowd, with an expression Wren, catching sight of it across the gathering nave, read as something closer to contrition than she had ever expected to see cross that particular face. An old woman's slow, grudging recognition that the girl she had spent years diminishing had outlasted every diminishment intact. Aunt Judith wept openly and without performance for the first time in the whole of Wren's memory of her, and gripped her hand before the ceremony with a fierceness that finally, at long last, felt entirely unmixed with calculation. The chapel filled early, tenants and shopkeepers and half the households of Millbrook crowding the modest pews and spilling out into the churchyard beyond, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by 3 years of small, uncredited kindnesses Wren had extended to people who had never expected a duke's ward to trouble herself with their drainage disputes, or their children's coughs, or their quiet domestic griefs, debts of ordinary decency called in now, all at once, in the warmest possible currency. It was, Wren thought, standing in the vestry in a gown of plain cream wool, unadorned but for her mother's ring, worn openly now on a ribbon at her throat rather than hidden beneath her collar, the first crowd in her memory gathered specifically, entirely, for her. The chapel bell had not yet finished its call when a commotion rose from the churchyard, hooves on wet gravel, a horse ridden hard and reined in harder, and the crowd, turning as one body toward the sound, watched the Duke of Rothmere dismount without ceremony, without escort, without a single one of the trappings his rank might have summoned had he chosen to arrive with all the pageantry available to him, and walk alone up the churchyard path in clothes still marked with the road, having ridden, Wren would learn later, through the better part of the night rather than risk arriving even an hour behind the sun. The room did not merely notice him. It held its collective breath the particular way a crowd holds its breath when it senses, correctly, that it is about to witness something it will describe for years afterward. And in that held breath, Alaric Vane crossed the churchyard and the chapel threshold, and came to stand not at the altar first, as custom and rank might have permitted him, but before the whole assembled parish, turning to face them rather than her, a small, deliberate inversion of every ceremony that house had ever hosted. They were wrong, he said, and his voice, though it did not rise, carried to the furthest pew with the particular authority of a man who had finally stopped disguising his sincerity as reserve. Every one of us who called an understanding sufficient, who mistook patience for consent, who let 3 years pass believing that silence was a kindness rather than a theft, was wrong. And I count myself first and worst among that number, because I had the power to end the waiting at any hour of any one of those 3 years and chose, out of a fear I am only now unashamed enough to name, to let a better person than myself carry the cost of my hesitation. He paused, and the chapel, Wren would remember, did not so much as creak around that pause, every soul present leaning, without quite meaning to, into the silence he had left for them. She corrected this estate's accounts for 3 years without once asking to be thanked for it, he said, and the room's stillness deepened. She endured this county's cruelty for 3 years without once returning it in kind. She held to her own dignity for 3 years when dignity was the only inheritance this world had left uncontested to her. And I have come to believe, standing here this morning in front of every person who ever doubted her worth, that there is no truer measure of character than what a person chooses to become when no one troubles to reward them for it. It was triadic praise, offered without artifice, and the crowd, hearing it, did not merely absorb it politely. A sound moved through the pews, low at first and then rising, the particular hum of a room recognizing, all at once, a truth it had been slow and cowardly to see for itself. "I hope," he said, and here his voice, for the first time in the whole address, wavered slightly, betraying beneath the Duke's composure the plain, unpolished feeling of the man Wren had come to know in a cold glass conservatory 3 months before. "I hope that whatever children this house is fortunate enough to raise after today will inherit her patience before they inherit anything of mine. Because a title, I have learned rather late in my life, is worth considerably less than the character required to hold one honestly." Then he turned, at last, to face her, and crossed the short distance of the aisle in the same measured, deliberate steps he had crossed the conservatory floor 3 months before, and the whole gathered parish, watching, seemed to lean forward as one body toward whatever was coming. "I did not come today because my father commanded it from his deathbed 30 years ago," he said, low enough now that it was meant for her alone, though the hushed chapel caught every word regardless. "I did not come because the county's good opinion required it of me, or because a scandal survived is more easily buried by a wedding than left open to further talk. I did not come," he said, and his voice caught, briefly, on something that was not performance, because no invitation obliged me to, no contract compelled me, and no one at all was watching to hold me to account if I had chosen, this morning, to stay away. "I came," he said, "because I wish it, because I have wished it for longer than I permitted myself to say, and because I find, having spent 3 years learning what it costs to withhold that wish, that I have no further patience remaining for withholding it even 1 day more." The chapel had gone entirely silent. The particular silence of a room that understands it is witnessing something it will be asked to describe for the rest of its natural life, and Wren, standing at the altar with her mother's ring warm at her throat and 30 years of a stolen, deferred, finally reclaimed promise settling into place around her, answered him in the same low voice, meant only for him though every soul in that chapel would claim, for years afterward, to have heard it. "Yes," she said, "because I wish it too." It was not a grand sentence. It required none of the ornament the moment might have justified. No lengthy vow, no elaborate promise, only the plain symmetry of an answer mirroring the question that had prompted it. 2 people choosing each other for no reason grander or more complicated than the wish itself, freely given and freely returned, and the chapel, released at last from its held breath, broke into applause that was not universal in the way a queen's coronation earns universal applause, orchestrated and obliged, but universal in the truer, rarer way, spontaneous, unrehearsed, a whole parish's genuine gladness, finding no reason left to restrain itself. Lady Prowse, seated in the front pew with her cane planted before her like a scepter, was heard afterward to observe, with evident satisfaction, that she had told them so, though no one present could recall her having said any such thing in quite those words, which she allowed, upon reflection, was very likely because she had been too busy proving it instead. The ceremony that followed was simple, unadorned by the standards Rothmere Hall had spent 3 years insisting a duke's marriage required. And it was, for exactly that reason, the truest thing that Old Chapel had witnessed in a generation. When the vicar came at last to the exchange of rings, Wren offered not the plain silver band that had traveled with her since childhood, which she had already decided, quietly, weeks before, to keep as her own rather than surrender to ceremony, but a second, newer ring the Duke had commissioned in secret from the same Ashdown seal cutter who had made his laurel-bordered crest, a plain hammered band deliberately unadorned, deliberately modest, deliberately unlike anything the Rothmere jewel case had produced in 3 generations, because he had told the seal cutter, when commissioning it, that he wanted a ring that looked as though it had been loved rather than merely purchased, and the plainest ring, she thought, feeling it settle onto her finger, could still hold the truest promise, exactly as her mother had always told her it would. That evening, as the sun set clear and gold over a churchyard, still scattered with the last well-wishers reluctant to end the day's celebration, the whole of Millbrook gathered for a modest feast laid out on trestle tables beneath the chapel's ancient yew, tenants and shopkeepers and the Duke of Rothmere himself, moving among them without the careful distance rank had always required of him before, and Wren, watching from the edge of the gathering with a cup of cider warming her hands, understood that this, more than the ceremony itself, was the truer vindication, an entire community that had watched her endure 3 years of quiet erasure now gathered, freely and without obligation, to celebrate the ending of it. It was some months later still, on a bright morning the following autumn, that the county assembled again, this time for the christening of a small stone almshouse Wren had commissioned on the eastern edge of the estate, built with her own dowry and her husband's blessing to house the widows and orphaned daughters of Rothmere's tenants, women the world had always found it easiest to overlook. And it was there, cutting the ribbon before a crowd considerably larger and more varied than the one that had gathered for her wedding, that Wren understood the true shape of the vindication she had spent 3 years waiting for, without knowing its final form. Not merely her own recognition, but the recognition, at last, of everyone the county had once found convenient to render invisible. Lady Beaumont, present at the christening in a gesture of reconciliation Wren had not expected, but had come, slowly to accept as genuine, remarked afterward, with none of her old careful cruelty, that she had spent 3 years underestimating a girl she ought to have studied more closely, and that she hoped, in whatever years remained to her, to make some small correction to that error. It was not an apology in any form the old Lady Beaumont would have recognized as necessary 3 years before, but it was, Wren thought, enough because there is a particular grace in watching a person who once diminished you arrive, however belatedly, at the truth of your worth, and that grace did not require, to be genuine, that it arrive perfectly or on time. That winter, the second of her marriage, brought a storm to Ashdown fiercer than any the county could recall. 3 days of wind and sleet that stripped the last leaves from Rothmere's ancient oaks and left the roads impassable, and the household confined once more to its fires, and Wren, standing at the same tall gallery window, where 3 years of waiting had once stretched before her like an unanswerable question, found herself unafraid of the weather in a way she had not been unafraid of much in that house before. Alaric found her there, as he so often did now, and stood beside her without speaking for a long while, watching the storm lash itself out against the glass, and when at last he spoke, it was only to observe, in the dry. Understated register she had come to love best of all his voices, that a storm like this one generally broke by dawn, and that dawn, in his experience, arrived considerably more beautiful for having been so thoroughly earned by the night before it. She did not ask him whether he meant the weather or something larger than the weather, because she had learned, across the whole of their long, careful courtship, that some of his truest sentences arrived exactly there, in the deniable space between the literal and the larger, and that this, too, was a kind of dry wit peculiar to him, permitted by nothing but his own honesty rather than his rank. The storm broke, as he had promised it would, somewhere in the small hours before dawn, and Wren woke before first light to a stillness so complete it felt, after 3 days of howling weather, like a held breath finally released, and rose and crossed to the window to watch the eastern sky over Ashdown's frost-silvered fields turn, by degrees from black to gray to a pale, clean gold that spilled at last across the whole quiet valley. Catching the wet stones of the churchyard wall and the bare branches of the yew and the small stone almshouse on the estate's eastern edge, gilding a world that had spent 3 long years finding every reason to overlook her, and now, in this ordinary, unremarkable dawn, simply looked the way any world looks after a long night finally ends. Washed clean and entirely unaware of the particular history it had just outlived. She was always worth believing in. That had been true in the humiliation of the drawing room, and true in the cold arithmetic of the estate office, and true in the anonymous cruelty of a forged accusation, true long before anyone in that house had troubled to notice it, and true just as fully in this quiet gray morning when noticing it had finally become the whole of the county's settled opinion, because worth of that kind had never required an audience to make it real. Only, eventually, an audience willing to see what had been real all along. Alaric came to stand beside her at the window as the light strengthened, and did not speak, and did not need to, and after a moment his hand found hers the way it had found it once before, in a cold glass conservatory, 3 years of waiting deep, open rather than grasping, offered rather than claimed, and she laced her fingers through his and held on, and neither of them let go. It was not perfect. It had never been easy, not the 3 years of waiting, nor the forged letter, nor the long, uneven work of learning to trust a silence that had once cost her so much, and it would not, she understood. Standing there with the dawn filling the gallery and the plain silver ring warm against her palm where it still rested, be effortless in all the years still ahead of them either. It was simply shared, at last, freely and without condition, 2 people who had each, in their own careful way, chosen the other, when nothing beyond the wish itself required it, and standing together in that clean, unremarkable morning light with their hands joined and the whole quiet valley waking slowly beneath them, Wren found that shared, imperfect, hard-won thing to be more than enough.